So good morning again to everyone, and welcome to the first session of the second day of our conference. My name is Olga Salazar. I'm a graduate student from the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, and I will be acting as the moderator for this first session. I would like to introduce now our distinguished presenters. So first we have Dr. Abigail Gewirtz, who is the John and Nancy Lindahl Leadership Professor in the Department of Family and Social Science in the Institute of Child Development. Dr. Gewirtz is also the director of the Institute of Translational Research in Children's Mental Health here at the University of Minnesota. So without further ado, I will be presenting each presenter with their titles. But just before I introduce Dr. Abby, I would just like to remind everyone that we will be taking questions after the 3 sessions have taken place, right? So without further ado, let me help me introduce, welcome our first presenter, Dr. Abigail Gewirtz, who will be presenting today her presentation titled, The Psychological Impact of Traumatic World Events on Children and Families.
Good morning, everybody. Buenos dias. My Spanish is extremely limited. I wish it was better, but it's really a treat to be here today, and it's also very special for me to be able to present at a truly interdisciplinary international conference, because usually I talk to other psychologists. You know, that's how it works. We all talk to the same people who do the same thing. So I was asked to talk a little bit. I'm a child psychologist, and I was asked to talk a little bit on the psychological trauma and its impact on children, and it is a vast area. And so I thought quite carefully about what I wanted to say, given that we have really an interdisciplinary group. So for the last 20 years, I've been focusing on how traumatic events, war, violence, disasters affect children, and particularly what parents can do to help them. But I have to say that over the last 4 years, like many of you around here, I've been increasingly troubled by what is happening in the world around us. And so actually, I want to talk about 2 different things today. I want to talk about regular life for children today in the US and Europe, in countries where we take for granted our safety, and most kids are not exposed to life-threatening traumatic events. Because I think that right now the world feels like a scary place. Does anyone agree with that? Anyone feel the same way? Yeah, okay. Confession. I have a book coming out next year with I don't know if that's considered a conflict of interest, with the same title. Because I worried a lot about how we explain. My children are a little bit older. I have 4 kids between the ages of 16 and 25. But I worry a great deal about parents who are bringing up young children today, and how to talk with children about the very troubling things that are happening in the world today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then I have like, how long, 20 minutes? 30. Ooh. So then I'm going to talk a little bit about my research on trauma, my team's research on trauma, resilience, and parenting. And I know that the topic was, the impact of traumatic events on children, but I'm a intervention researcher, so I'm interested in how bad things happen, but I'm more interested in what we can do about that. And so I'll share a little bit of the scientific research on how, because I think it's also very heartening on how we can actually help change the paths of families' lives by providing effective programming for families. So, what's different in today's world? How many of you grew up either in the United States or in Europe? Okay, most of you. All right. And Latin America? Okay. So, most of you still grew up in countries where they were reasonably peaceful, and I would say that today's youth are growing up with a lot of things that certainly I can speak for myself, at my generation didn't have to deal with. But objectively speaking, in the United States, the world is not a less safe place. So what's the discrepancy here? So I would suggest that there are 5 key things that distinguish today's growing up world from the world that me and my peers grew up in. Those are violence, specifically the incredible proliferation of guns, and the very widely publicized shootings in schools and public areas in the US. Technological innovation, so many of you are probably younger than me, but we certainly didn't grow up with cell phones. We didn't grow up with the web and with Facebook and Snapchat and Instagram. And those can be tremendous forces for good, and they also do bring news to us all the time, instantaneously. And I'm going to explain why that can be very troubling for children in particular. Climate. So climate has been talked about as possibly the single biggest existential challenge to our world. And what we are seeing, particularly here, is increasing numbers of climate disasters, not just in America, in Asia, disproportionately also, but even in Europe, we see, and in the Americas, Latin America, we see the scope of disasters that we see is very different from what we saw 30 years ago. We're also living in a very divided world. I don't think anyone would disagree that we have a very divided democracy in this country, but not only in this country, throughout the world. We've seen the rise of authoritarian strongmen, which has resulted in a significant rise in hate crimes. And related to that, we have significant injustice. We've always had injustice, but injustice and bias seems to take a different turn in today's world, and divided democracy. So I'm not going to talk a lot about what we can do, but our research on trauma has showed us that there are ways that you can help children deal with these scary events. And I'm not talking about children who have witnessed a shooting or experienced their home being blown away by a hurricane or a tornado. I'm talking about kids who live everyday, typical lives. But as adults and parents, we often aren't taught how to and what to say to children about scary things. And that's been the focus of my research. And I call these discussions about scary things essential conversations. So I want to just highlight something that I know one of the next speakers is going to highlight. Is that you? Which is that the crime is down in the United States, but we're not feeling like that. So actually, crime is down by an astonishing amount. More than half since the 1990s. But anxiety and depression in children are at record levels, and even higher in some children. Youth report feeling increasingly overwhelmed. And just in the 5 years for which data are most recently available, 2010 to 2015, depression and suicide in adolescents markedly increased. I'm sorry you can't see these very well, but what I want to say is that even school violence until 2016 was down, despite the incredibly widely publicized school shootings. I was a new psychologist in the 90s, and I was very involved in the aftermath of the Columbine shootings. And I remember, there was a rash of shootings in the late 90s in schools. But even given, though, those kinds of incidents, overall, school violence is down. Now, that is not the case for the last 3 years. There has not been a very significant increase, but it's a little bit higher, as you can imagine. Violent deaths in schools, same thing. If you look over the period on the left, the beginning of the x-axis is from 1992 all the way to 2014-15, for which is the last year that data are available. You see on average a decrease in student, staff, and other non-student school-associated violent deaths over those couple of decades. And I'm just going to talk briefly about the other kinds of things that have kids feeling scared. So why is technology not always a good thing? I'm sure I'm not the only person to think that, right? For children, for parents, it's very difficult to know what children are doing on their phones. And does anyone know the average age at which a child in the United States gets their first cell phone? Yes, 10 years old. Yeah. And by their early teens, more than 4/5 of children have cell phones. So they're great platforms for bullying children. And one of the worst things that I've seen is an increase in encouraging children who are very vulnerable and thinking of suicide. So encouraging kids to commit suicide via online bullying texts. But the other problem with technology is that it provides children with immediate access to news 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So a child with a cell phone will be sitting in school and will watch an Amber Alert come across their phone. That's an alert that a child has been kidnapped. And then he might see a tornado warning that there's bad weather in the area. And then he might see that 3 people were killed in a shooting somewhere else in the United States. And the problem for children is that their brains are still developing, and especially for younger children, they don't have the same cognitive capacity as older adults to understand where bad things are happening and what that means for them. It's pretty scary. It means that by the time a child gets home off the school bus, the parents really don't have a lot of time to process all the many things that have happened to the child in the school day, and that I'm just talking about on the phone. We talked a little bit about the challenges of climate change. I didn't talk earlier about widening inequalities. So this, probably you know that we've never had a larger gap between rich and poor in this country. And around the world, we have massive migration. And I became interested in this a couple of years ago, but in 2015, I think 2015 was the year of the largest movement of people across countries since World War II. So then, related to migration, of course, migration and immigration becomes a lightning rod and another opportunity, a test case for how we are willing to treat people, and unfortunately we're failing the test. And then, of course, our divided society. And for some reason, over the last few years, we have seen an increase in apparently what we are willing to stomach when it comes to seeing the way leaders behave. Apparently. I keep telling my husband, just switch the news off. I just wish the oxygen would be pulled out of the room so that we wouldn't have to hear this. But it's pretty typical for us to hear and see hateful things every day. Prejudiced and biased and really sort of outrageous things. And of course, there's no such thing as truth anymore either. Hopefully someone's talked about that. That's, this whole idea of fake news, and and that's a very big challenge to help children understand what is truth? What is real? What do you trust? And I think one of the most important things is, how can you be civil in a society that is increasingly not civil? So those are our challenges. How do adults matter in all this? How many of you have children? How many of you were children? Okay, I rest my case. So what we know, what science tells us, is the way we talk and behave with kids help us show them that the world can be a safe place. That regardless of what happens around you, that there are things that can be predictable and routine and that they are loved. And even if you cannot control anything, there's very little you can control in your life. There are certain things that grown-ups can do to help their children feel secure and confident. And one of my favorite examples is of a boy I'll call Juan, who was brought by his mother to the United States across the Mexican border. She was fleeing domestic violence. She didn't know that she could seek asylum, and they lived as undocumented immigrants for many, many years. And he grew up, and he is now in his early 20s, and she gave him the security and the confidence and the compassion to be successful. She took him out of the public school, which she felt was not a good place for him. She applied for parochial school. The first parochial school she applied to said that they needed a social security card to be able to admit him to the school, social security number. One of his best friend's fathers offered to adopt him in order that he could come to the school. She declined. And she found another school that would take him, tuition-free. He became a dreamer. He went to St. Olaf, and he now works for Target. And, when I talk about these stories, the hairs on my arms go up, because I think that, I think of how, especially now, his mom is really scared even to drive. One time in St. Paul, this was maybe 10 years ago, someone crashed into her, and of course, what happened? She got a ticket because she didn't have a driver's license. She showed them her Mexican driver's license, and of course, that was not sufficient. But regardless of the situations, and we've learned this from many years of studying families in very traumatic situations, parents can support children to grow up to be healthy and compassionate and resilient kids. And so this was going to be my, I've got 2 more slides, and then I'm going to spend like a few minutes talking about research. I've got till another 10, 15 minutes? Yeah, okay, sorry. Yeah. So one of the most important things to do is adults can't help their children if they can't deal with their own emotions. So I think, Brian, you probably talked about PTSD yesterday. And one of the hallmarks of post-traumatic stress disorder, when adults have been exposed to a traumatic event and that has affected the way we are able to be, is that these traumatic events, they disrupt our ability to regulate our emotions. We hear something that reminds us of a terrible thing that happened, and we are immediately transported back to that time. And that means that it's very hard for us to be in the present, which is very important for parents. So the first step is really to be able to regulate our own emotions and to think carefully about these things. And if it's just a question of the news making you feel really angry, switch off the news, and you'll be able to support your children better, as a very sort of small example. But the other thing is that we are not usually, as a culture, taught to teach our children about emotions. We call that a process of emotion socialization. But it's really important. What we know is that parents who are more effective at coaching their children in emotions, at talking with them about emotional events, at helping them find strategies that help them effectively process big emotions, scary things, and by having children watch their parents deal effectively with stressful things, children grow up and are less likely to be anxious and depressed and suicidal. And parents also need to help their children learn how to problem solve in a very complex world, and they need to be able to effectively set limits. So I'm just going to talk, I'll just spend 1 minute on this. I could spend a whole day talking about the impact of scary things on children's development. Of course, children change rapidly. You cannot compare the brain or what a child of 2 is able to understand and process compared with a young person of 18 or 21. And brain development is most rapid at 2 periods of life. The first few years of life, and when's the next most rapid period of brain development? No psychologist is allowed to answer this. Anyone know? Teens, exactly, during adolescence, which has very significant implications for how we think about the impact of traumatic and scary things on development. So, for example, small example, teenagers look like adults in the sophistication, in the very clear critical thinking skills that they bring to debates about the death penalty or guns, things like that. But when it comes to actually doing, behaving like an adult, not so much. And that's why, for example, teens die in car crashes, drunk, because they think that they can drink and they can drive and that a car crash won't happen to them. It's a really unique kind of, and it's because the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that is responsible for telling us, hold on, let's think this through, is not quite developed yet. So we have to really think about development in order to understand how children process these difficult events. But the most important thing, I think, is just to talk to children. And I was kind of shocked because I was preparing for another talk and I was wondering, how many minutes a day do parents spend talking with their children? Just talking. Does anyone know? Huh? How much time each day do we spend just talking with our children? Take guesses. 10 minutes? 1 hour? 20 minutes? I'm afraid the woman who said 0 was closest. It's not 0, thank goodness. It's like 3 minutes a day. 3 minutes a day. This comes from a nationwide representative survey of parents, adults in households, who are asked to categorize how they spend their time. And talking with or to children was a category, and on average, parents spend 3 minutes a day. So I asked parents, if you just spend 10 minutes a day, that'd be great. It's amazing what you might hear if you actually take 10 minutes. Anyway, so I'll leave you with that, if I leave you that one thing, yeah. So let me talk a little bit about the research that has informed what I just spoke about. And I decided I was going to do the research first, but then I decided I might never get to the other thing, and I wanted to make sure I did because I think it's the more applicable piece. Why is it so important to think about parenting when it comes to children's resilience? And it's because parents are really crucial, right? Parents, interestingly enough, you might think, well, duh, of course parents are crucial. Actually, parenting is just kind of so important when you live a low-risk life, right? You can be a kind of not-so-great parent, and your kid will be okay which is comforting, right? Certainly comforting to me, if your child lives a low-risk life. But if your child is exposed to adversity or trauma, parenting is really crucial, and it's really important that you be effective. The problem is, it's in those kinds of situations that parenting suffers most. We have a lot of research to understand why that is. And our research has focused on 2 key questions around this, which is, how does effective parenting support children's recovery from traumatic events? And how do parents' experiences of trauma affect their own parenting? And we've studied this from a social interaction learning perspective, and don't worry about this, but just the main thing to take away is that what we know about children's well-being is that outside stressful events, traumatic experiences, poverty, war, violence, affect children, but they primarily affect them through how their parents behave towards them. So these bad things have direct effects on children for sure, but they have indirect effects. Well, it would make sense if you think that parents live with their children and they're the people who filter the world. And that's essentially the issue here. So parenting matters a lot. And the person who did this fantastic work, who's really foundational to this research, is a man by the name of Jerry Patterson, who actually did his PhD here at the University of Minnesota in the 1950s. And he was a veteran of World War II. And he wanted to understand how children got into trouble. He was really primarily interested in delinquency and criminality. And what he found was that it was when parents were stressed that they behaved in an impatient and coercive way with their children. And that, in turn, led to children growing up with the idea that this is the way you interact with people. You yell to get your own way. You twist their arms if they're not doing what you want. And I'm making this I'm just really giving you like the thumbnail, broadest brushstrokes. But I will say that Patterson was an extremely careful scientist, and he recorded thousands of hours of videotape and really documented carefully the moment-by-moment interactions that happened between parents and children. And what we know from our own research is this, in fact, is not just the case in terms of children's behavior problems and delinquency and criminality, but parenting is also crucial for children's anxiety and their likelihood to, their distress after a traumatic event. And we also have learned in a lot of research, primarily actually with soldiers who've returned from war, that parents who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder really do show difficulties in their parenting. But all is not lost. The great thing is that one of my favorite sayings is that parents are their children's best teachers. And we know from 50 years of work to develop parent training programs that evidence-based, effective programs can change the trajectory of children's and families' lives. And I've only got a couple more minutes, so I'm going to show you one more slide. One of my colleagues did a study, just a very regular study, looking at trying a parenting program with single moms, half of whom lived in poverty, and this was in the 1990s. And she followed the mothers for 9 years after she offered them a 2-hour-a-week, 14-week parenting program. 14 weeks, 2 hours a week, random assignment for those of you who are, who are scientists. So half the moms were randomly assigned to be invited to the program, and half not. And she followed these mums for 9 years. The first thing that happened was that by observation, the mums' parenting improved. And then, by teacher reports, the children's behavior improved. And then by police reports, over several years, the rates of arrests and substance use reduced, both for moms and for children. And 9 years later, the moms who were assigned to the intervention group had more income, higher education, and better jobs than the moms who didn't go through the program. And that, to me, truly is the promise of parenting programs, that they show what we call, in the science, cascading effects on parents and children. And I've been very grateful to spend my career with amazing graduate students and a very big team focusing on how we can strengthen parenting among families exposed to traumatic events. And those include domestic violence, homelessness, immigrant families fleeing war, refugee families in the United States, and military families with parents deployed to combat. And I wish I could spend more time talking to you about those things, but I think my time is up. I have 1 minute. My time is up. But I'm happy to share the slides and also some of the readings and some of the work. So thank you. Yeah, sure.